The Austrian Grand Prix has turned out to be one of the most controversial races in 2024, especially in the closing stages when Norris and Verstappen were fighting fiercely for the win, but the Dutchman decided to take his elbows out, resulting in Norris ending his race while Max dropping down to P5. However, with Verstappen ultimately getting out as the winner of this event and extending the lead to both Norris and Leclerc for an additional 10 points, Norris will have a lot to say about this type of racing, and with the field now closer than ever, could accidents like this happen more often than not? It's safe to say that the start of the Austrian Grand Prix was not as interesting as expected, given the fact that Verstappen managed to get a solid lead from lap 1 and cruise to what would be the 60-second win of his career. However, once the first stint on the medium tyre ended, the three-time world champion started to report problems with the performance of the hard tyre, even though he managed to keep a solid advantage over Norris around 8 seconds. It was obvious that the third stint would be extremely important for both drivers, but this is where the Brit had the advantage. He had brand new soft or medium tyres, and with Verstappen having a bit slower pit stop due to the stuck rear tyre, we were promised and given some interesting racing between both of the drivers. Nonetheless, Lando was trying his best to get past Verstappen, considering the fact that the tyres of the Dutchman were already a couple of laps old, but the racecraft of the three-time world champion seemed unmatched. At lap 64, however, Norris tried to give his everything at the outside of turn 2, where he previously went a bit too wide a couple of laps before and gave his position back like he should have. Something that Verstappen refused to do when he did more or less the same thing in these times of hard racing. Still, the culmination happened at lap 64, when Verstappen moved under braking, something he was doing on a constant matter throughout the defence of Norris, and causing him to be overly cautious as he entered the corners, which made him lose some quality time that needed to be caught with the DRS. On lap 64, this contact saw both of the drivers go out of the track and sustain damage to both of their cars. And while the initial impression was that it was Verstappen who had suffered more due to the visible puncture of his rear right, the same happened to Norris, who tried to overtake Verstappen on the straight right afterwards, but the Dutchman closed the door and the Brit went on the grass. Regardless, it was obvious that both of the cars would have to go to the pit stop, but the damage that Norris has suffered from is terminal, as it was visible through his emotions in the pit stop that he wouldn't let this slide away for the remainder of the 2024 season. Definitely, another move from Verstappen that Norris wasn't quite happy about is that the Brit was pushed on the grass by the Dutchman, even though the three-time world champion was driving extremely slowly because of the rear tyre puncture. This act has been labelled as childish and quite immature from a man who has won 61 races in his career and couldn't accept the fact that for once, maybe he does not have the opportunity to defend the win thanks to his skill set, as the advantage was clearly on McLaren and Norris's side this time, even though one could argue that this question could have been answered a couple of laps before the infamous 64th out of 71 total laps of the race. The greatest loser from the Austrian Grand Prix shouldn't even be discussed. It's Lando Norris. Even if he didn't win the fight with Verstappen, he would have lost only 6 points in the championship lead, not 10 like he did right now. But if he won, which he had a great chance and opportunity to do so, he would have cut it to 62 out of the 69 that were standing before the Austrian Grand Prix. Moreover, he would have proven to the entire F1 world that just because you are trailing for 70% of the race doesn't mean that you're going to lose. Quite the contrary, the race isn't done until it's done. And now it's more than obvious that he won't be paying any attention to Verstappen or watching the manners that he is racing him with, mostly because the Dutchman has shown his true face yet again. When talking briefly about the incident with Max, Norris said, "If Max says he did nothing wrong, I'll lose a lot of respect." Of course, had it not been for the slow pit stop of Max Verstappen, where Norris gained more than 3 seconds of time, it might not even have come to this. But it's racing, and stuff like this happens all of the time. The reality is that once racing happens, it should be conducted in a proper manner, and while Verstappen was denying any fault on his own, many have seen some flashbacks of his old self, like the 2021 version, where he couldn't care less about what type of damage the other driver or even his car would sustain as long as he remained ahead. When talking on the team radio after the race, Verstappen went on to say, "Of course I received a 10-second penalty. Yeah, sure. You can't just send it left and right. What do you want me to do?" To this, his race engineer Lambiase replied, "Norris didn't behave correctly there, Max. So yeah, desperately unlucky, especially here, but you did your very best." One couldn't help but wonder what type of team Red Bull turned out to be in this situation, when it was plain obvious that Max was moving under braking in many situations, got away with it even though it was reported many times on the radio from McLaren, and didn't even address this situation properly once the damage was done to the car. Luckily for Max, he managed to continue the race and is now 79 points ahead of Norris in the Drivers' Championship. But it's obvious that racing like this will happen more frequently in the foreseeable future if McLaren manages to be a bit faster on circuits that didn't really suit them in the past. Austria was the race where they managed to bring upgrades last year and finish on the podium with Norris. But here the team wasn't really hopeful that they could compete with Max, given the fact that it was for the first time in the last couple of races where the qualifying difference was more than 1 to 2 tenths, 4 tenths to be precise. Still, there were some other factors that should be taken into consideration by the Austrian Grand Prix, such as the fact that Red Bull had an extremely slow pit stop and the fact that Verstappen wasn't extremely happy with the car, especially on the hard tyre as he started to lose time to Norris even before they were brought so close after the pit stop drama. This is something that the Dutchman addressed to his team engineer. And even though he got out as the biggest winner in this situation because the second and third place drivers in the Drivers' Championship did not get any points, it's Verstappen that we're talking about. And that means anything less than perfection won't suit his driving style. When talking about the remainder of the season, Verstappen went on to say, "The race itself was also just bad, to be honest. I need things to improve on, but it is what it is." A big question is also being asked to the stewards as to whether or not they could have done something to prevent this fierce racing early. For example, penalising Max for moving under braking and not giving the position back after Norris was ahead of him at the apex of turn 2. Something similar that happened between Hamilton and Sainz in the early stages of the race, where the Brit was forced to give the position back in order to avoid penalty. On top of that, this isn't the first instance in which Verstappen has been under investigation from the FIA and managed to get away with a penalty, such as driving unnecessarily slow in the pit lane on Saturday, which begs the question as to whether or not the governing body is playing their favourites with the 3-time world champion. Of course, we must be objective here and talk about Norris's 5-second penalty that would have ended any chance of a potential race fight, because it would have been quite impossible for the Brit to pass Verstappen with 4 to 5 laps remaining and build a 5-second advantage over him, as chasing the Red Bull driver forced him to cause multiple track violations and receive the black and white flag. But nonetheless, it was competitive driving that Mercedes profited a lot from, gaining 37 points and slowly but surely crawling into the top 3 in the championship, considering the fact that Leclerc and Ferrari have had yet another disastrous race due to the lap 1 contact with Piastri. With all this in mind, do you think that Verstappen was at fault for the collision with Norris? And more importantly, do you think that the penalties he received are fair? Let us know in the comments below, and once you do that, make sure to click on the video that is appearing on your screen right now.